Dialed In Angling Podcast presented by Onyx Fish, Runnings, Arneson's Rocky Point Resort, Visit Watertown, South Dakota, Man Trap Lake Lodge, and Visit Cook County. Well, this week on the podcast, we're going to dive into everything pike. You know, pike are one of those polarizing species. Either you love them, you hate them. For me, my passion for pike grew when I was a kid. I'll get into that. But I want to start with pike are becoming very rare, especially big pike. On this podcast, I want to dive into pike fishing, but specifically targeting giant pike. They're just one of those mythical species that seems to have disappeared out of our waters. They do exist, but you got to dig a little bit deeper to find them in our lakes. I know Minnesota has done some special regulations over the last few years. They have, their pike work groups that have worked on, various zones across the state. We're going to dive into that as well. But let's get into pike fishing as a whole. The reason I'm talking about it right now in the fall is because in the spring and in the fall, it seems to me that that's the best pike fishing that you can find, especially for big ones. These big pikes seem to disappear throughout the summer months. It seems like when water temps get into the mid 60s, these fish just sort of disappear. Like in the spring, you can find them in these shallow bays, in the rocks. You can kind of find them all over, especially lakes like Mille Lacs, Leech Lake, but even some smaller lakes that I know of that hold big pike. They come in the shallows in the spring, they spawn, and then they kind of hang around until surface temperatures start to rise. And then a lot of them will go out and disappear. Now with forward-facing sonar, we've seen some of these fish. I see them, kind of pelagic sometimes out over deep water. These fish are chasing bait fish. Some of them are suspended. Some are just out in deep water, on structure, feeding. Sometimes they're relating to habitat. Sometimes they're just open water roamers. I just remember catching big pike on Mille Lacs Lake, trolling lead core, for example. We're just out in the middle of the basin trolling walleyes, and boom, lo and behold, you get a 40 plus inch pike out there. And, that type of species that roams all summer, then again, returns in the fall, and you can start catching them. And that's exactly the time of year. Right now is when they start coming in. Late September, early October is a great time period to target these species. Now, again, there's passionate anglers that absolutely love pike fishing, and there's people that hate them. I take people out fishing from all over the country, specifically, walleye anglers in particular, but I do take a lot of bass anglers that come, from all over outside of our region, let's say, Missouri, Arkansas, Southern Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Nebraska, and even, you think walleye anglers disapprove pike, bass anglers do as well. And a lot of that stems from the fact that they get bit off a lot, right? And they don't know how to handle them. A lot of people don't know how to handle pike. They say they stink. I'm the opposite. I can think back as a kid, everybody has those like trigger fish or trigger moments that drives them as an angler, right? Catching bluegills with my grandparents, with my parents as a young kid, catching them off a dock, catching bass off a dock. But for me, northern pike is what hooked me on fishing big time. I mean, there's no doubt about it. Yes, I have early recollection of catching big walleyes with my dad on Mille Lacs Lake or on Winnie or wherever, but catching pike off my parents' dock where it's like just me fishing as a 10-year-old, for example, throwing a spoon off the dock and reeling in, about a 3-pound pike, because at that point it was like, that's the biggest fish I had ever caught, on my own, just by myself. And bringing this thing up thinking, I don't even know how to unhook it, So I remember dragging this northern pike through the grass up the hill to my parents' house and yelling for my dad to come unhook this pike. And he unhooked it, and we walked it back down to the dock and let it go. But from then on, I thought, man, I want to pike fish. And so I used to walk the shoreline from my parents' house all the way around the lake I grew up on. If you went, sort of to the right of my parents' house, there was no other docks or any homes along there. It was real wooded. So I just would walk the shoreline when the lake would get a little bit low and catch tons of pike. We did it all summer long. I had friends that would come out with me. We would throw, anything from spoons to weedless spoons to the Northland jawbreaker spoons, spinner baits, and catch northern pike. I remember going into the river systems as well. The lake river system I grew up on, any of the backwaters, there was some backwater channels, and we used to catch pike. And back then, they were actually pretty nice pike. I mean, if you got a 10-pounder, that was a big one, but you didn't catch many that were under 24 inches, and so it was a good quality fishing experience. I remember going out almost every cast, catching them at times, especially if the wind was blowing or if the cabbage was right or if it was just perfect timing throughout the year. And generally that was like late May, early June, just as school had gotten out, I would do some pike fishing. And then, of course, that sort of ramped up to when I got my own boat. I mean, the makeup of the catch that I would be fishing, yes, we would troll shad raps, but we would catch walleyes on my parents' lake, but we'd catch a lot of northern pike, and it was fun. I remember catching these, big northern pike and trying to kind of, push the boundaries of what I could catch on the tackle that and the rods and reels and the line that I was using at the time. Because at the time, it was like pre-braid. It was pre-fluorocarbon. I just had monofilament. And so most of the time what I had tied up was like 8-pound mono. 8-pound mono was pretty standard back then. Everybody tied up, sort of 8-pound monofilament, and you used it for everything. And so, I remember experimenting with leaders, with different types of lures, trying to catch them on topwater, watching in fishermen, catch them on top water, watching in fishermen catch these giant pike up in Canada that were tail dancing on the water. That's where my passion for pike really just triggered just my fishing experience. And people always ask me all the time, like, what's your favorite species to target? And I don't necessarily have one. Yes, at heart, I love fishing walleyes, but if you listen to the podcast, at different times of the year, different species sort of fuel my passion for the angling experience. And so it could be big panfish, it could be walleyes, it could be smallmouth bass, it could be largemouth, it could be pike, but specifically big pike. Yes, I don't mind going out and whaling on pike. I can think of so many different lakes that I could go to and catch tons and tons of pike right now. But big pike is what would get me out of bed to go chase a species. And in the fall, like we're experiencing right now, this time period, I have big pike on my mind. A matter of fact, I'll post some pictures on Facebook. This podcast post is pictures of me with some customers catching some big pike. And yeah, it's a short window this time of year and in the spring where these fish come in and you can target them in good numbers in shallower water. So I want to dive into that. I want to dive into technique. I want to dive into lakes that you can find these fish. And I also want to chat a little bit about experimental regulations that Minnesota has done, setting up the state into zones, trying to create better pike fishing, this quality pike initiative. I think it's a really good thing for the state because, like I said, there's so many lakes that we have that I feel had good pike that sort of dwindled over the years. And now it seems like we're stuck with a lot of hammer handle pike. And I want to just talk, briefly on these zones, but in depth, why these zones were set up to inspire or to create a better pike environment, if you will. So stay tuned. When we come back, let's dive into these regulations and how the state of Minnesota has broke down different zones to create better pike fishing in the state. We'll be back with more Dialed In Angling after this.
Man Trap Lodge, a Park Rapids resort on beautiful Big Man Trap Lake. Features 16 decked-out private cabins with air conditioning, Wi-Fi, and a rare Northwood swimming pool. Cabins are available with 1 to 5 bedroom units to select from. Whether you're looking for a fishing trip, a family vacation, or a family reunion, Man Trap Lodge is the Park Rapids resort for you. Rent one of our fishing boats for a great day of fishing or a pontoon to cruise around the lake and relax. Man Trap Lodge is a truly magical Minnesota vacation spot that's fun for the whole family. Don't miss your chance to book your late summer or fall trip at Man Trap Lodge for some fantastic fishing. Check us out at mantraplodge.com.
Runnings Home, Farm, and Outdoor stores are celebrating 78 years, serving 90 local communities across the Upper Midwest, the Northeast, and America's Heartland. Runnings has everything you and your family need for your home, on the farm, and in the outdoors. Lawn and garden, hardware, farm and ranch supplies, sporting goods, housewares, snacks, and everything for your pets. Go to runnings.com to find one of the 90 locations near you or shop online anytime at runnings.com. Runnings, your home, farm, and outdoor store.
Watertown, South Dakota is your hub for year-round fishing in the heart of the Glacial Lakes region. With Lakes Kempeska and Pelican right in town and dozens more just a short drive away, you'll find non-stop action for walleye, perch, and pike, just to name a few. When you're off the water, explore the Terry Redlin Art Center, Bramble Park Zoo, and many other great museums. Plus, award-winning pizza and family-friendly fun around every corner. Easy to reach, hard to leave. Plan your next cast at visitwatertownsd.com. So much Watertown, so little time.
All right, let's dive back into this big pike conversation, starting with, some zones that the state of Minnesota set up a few years ago to kind of trigger some better quality pike fishing in the state. Like I said, when I was a kid, it seemed like you could go to a lot of locations and catch decent sized pike. To me, like a hammer handle was like a 24-incher, right? And now it seems like a lot of lakes you go to, it's hard to catch 24-inchers. It's a lot of these little 17 to 22-inch fish. They're all over the place. I can think of a few lakes that I fish close to home where there used to be giant pike in there. And now it's like just these dwarfed little pike everywhere. And it seems to be a phenomenon, kind of across the state. But also, depending on where you're at in the state, there's varying issues with pike size and quality of pike in different areas. So, the state really set up these zones. And at first I was a little bit confused by it. I know these regulations have been in place for, better part of a decade now, or close to a decade. But when they were first set up, there was a little bit of confusion among anglers. What can you keep? What can't you keep? I know for people that spear, there was confusion, like what can you spear? How do you know based on size limit? So let's just break down the zones first of all, and I'll talk a little bit about why they set the regulations for the zones. And then moving forward, what I think is going to happen with pike, and what I'm also seeing, because you set these special regulations and you think, okay, immediately you're going to have results of better pike fishing or better quality pike fishing. And it takes time. I'm starting to see it in some locations, but other areas it's, sort of still in question. So I guess it's lake by lake basis. And, always check your lake or the lake you're going to for any sort of special regulations on pike. But let's start with the northeastern zone. So basically this is like Highway 53 and east. So like from Duluth to International Falls, that Highway 53 that runs up there. If you're used to going up to the Rainy River, that road and east, that's the northeastern zone. You can only have 2 pike, 1 over 40, and all fish between 30 and 40 have to be immediately released. The north central zone, which makes up most of the state, I would say 3/4 of the state. So, the western border up to the Canadian border from Highway 53 west, and then all the way down to Highway 212, basically. The Minnesota River, Mississippi, the Wisconsin border there. Everything north of that is kind of that north central zone. And that's sort of where I fish primarily. I mean, that's where most of the lakes I fish, from Mille Lacs to Leech to Brainerd, everything in between. And, this regulation, when it was set in place, was sort of shocking to me. I didn't realize what, or didn't know what the DNR was trying to do here. But that north central zone, which is 3/4 of the state, basically reads a 10 fish limit. Only 2 can be over 26 inches. All fish, or all northern pike between 22 and 26 inches, have to be immediately released. We'll get into that. I was very confused by this regulation. I've talked to countless biologists and DNR about the regulation and why it was set into place. And so we'll get into that in a minute. Lastly, the southern zone. This would be like Highway 212 to Chaska, south of State Highway 41, to the Minnesota River, to the Mississippi and the Wisconsin border. So, southern, I would say 1/4 of the state, basically. And it's just 2 fish, minimum size are 24. So you've got varying regulations based on region of the state. And, let's start with the northeastern zone. They have that 2 fish limit, 1/40, everything between 30 and 40 have to be released. What I've been told about that area is there's a lot of really good pike up there. The pike fishing still is really good. There's giant fish. They want to protect a lot of those big fish, and that they have slower growth rates. So they want you to keep some of these smaller ones, and they encourage you to throw back the big ones. And I would say for any of these regulations, and for me, a 40-inch pike is a beauty. I encourage catch and release always, always, always. I'll say this a lot. I do like eating fish. Northern pike are an excellent table fare fish. If you can get rid of the bones, which I do, some of these smaller pike are fantastic. I love pickling pike. I like eating pike. So don't get me wrong. I'm not opposed to keeping fish, but really, if you catch a fish over 40 inches, I highly recommend you throw these fish back. They've become so rare that, they're hard to find. They truly are. A 40-inch pike is very, very rare. And so if you catch one, some people may never catch one in their lifetime. I highly encourage you to take a picture, get some measurements, and get that girl back in the water. But this northwest zone, 2 fish, 1/40, 30 to 40 have to be released. They set that regulation because there are a lot of big pike. They're trying to maintain that large pike population. And then if allowing people to harvest some under 30 inches, for table fare, and it's a 2 fish limit. This north central zone, this is the zone I'm talking about where these lakes are just overrun with these small 15 to 23-inch pike, 22-inch pike. They're everywhere. Some of these lakes are absolutely loaded with them. I can think of countless lakes off the top of my head that I could just rattle off on this podcast that are absolutely full of these small fish. And so what they're thinking was allow people to keep 10 fish, right? If people want to pickle a bunch of pike, if you enjoy eating pike like I do, especially in the winter, taking kids out fishing. I can think of times where I took my kids out and their buddies out, and we wanted to make a batch of pickled fish because, like, my dad loves pickled fish. A lot of my friends, I enjoy pickled pike, homemade pickled pike. It's funny because if you offer me like pickled herring, like commercial grade pickled herring, I don't really like it. It's okay. Not a huge fan. However, the firmness of pike, and when you can take those small fish, you don't have to worry about the bones. You can dissolve them, pickle them. They're excellent. They're fantastic to bring out in the fish house. In the winter, if you're at a gathering, they go fast. People eat them. And so that's where this 10 fish regulation came into play. Now, 10 fish, but only 2 can be over 26. All from 22 to 26 have to be immediate release. So that means you can only have 2 over 26, nothing from 22 to 26, and then everything else has to be under 22. So a lot of those smaller pike make excellent pickled fish. You could still take out the Y bones on some of these small fish and have an awesome meal, but they're encouraging you to take up to 10 a person. Now, me personally, even taking the kids out, how many pike do you need for a batch of pickling? So, typically we kept 8 to 10, that was a lot of fish to pickle. But they're encouraging people to take more fish in that size category and to get rid of some of the smaller ones in the system and to promote growth of these bigger fish. So that was the mindset of this North Central zone. Again, having those 2 over 26, I encourage anybody, you get those fish that are in the 30s, especially like mid 30s and above, catch and release, please. I mean, these are special fish, and I would highly encourage you to throw these big fish back. Take a photo and get them back in the lake. These are the fish that we're trying to promote. These are the genetics we're trying to promote. Just like big panfish, big walleyes, big pike are along that same category. It takes a long time for these fish to grow, and I strongly encourage catch and release on that. Now, lastly, the southern zone, which I don't fish down there very often, or if ever, but it's a 2 fish minimum of 24 inches. And what I've been told is the growth rates are really fast in this zone. These pike grow extremely fast. And so, they want you to keep a couple of bigger fish because they grow fast, and, they're worried about too many fish, growing quickly, I guess, is sort of their mindset. I don't fish down there. I know a few anglers that spend a lot of time in southern Minnesota. Ask them. I don't know any good pike lakes down there, but I'm sure they exist with the river and everything. I'm sure there's lots of pike opportunities on different lakes down there, but it's 2 fish over 24 inches. That's kind of how Minnesota goes about it. I don't know the regulations when it comes to, North Dakota, Wisconsin. I know there's some experimental regulation lakes over there as well. But, that's what we have in Minnesota. I think it's the step in the right direction to growing big pike. And, so make sure that you're checking lakes, especially some lakes have special regulations on their own. Some, instead of 10 fish, they may only have a 3 fish limit or a 5. Mille Lacs has been changing over the years. Make sure that you're checking the regulations on the lake that you're fishing specifically, because that's going to dictate what you can harvest and what you can't. And, for me, a lot of times in the fall, when I'm going out specifically pike fishing, I might keep a couple, especially in this north central zone, where you can have 2 over 26. Like a 27, 28 inch pike, that's perfect. If I can keep one of those to take the Y bones out and cook them up, I love either baked pike, grilled is fantastic. Even pan fried in chunks are excellent. Like pike is a really firm meat. It's a delicious meat. If you get the Y bones out, I know they get a bad rap. Oh, they're slimy, they're stinky. In cold water, especially in the fall like this, they're fantastic. I can't think of a better fish to eat as far as texture and everything. I remember going up to Canada with my Uncle Gary, and there was a whole bunch of anglers up there, and they were saying, oh man, I hate pike. I don't like eating pike. They're not good. They're disgusting. They stink. And Gary, he's always an antagonist. He caught about a 28 inch pike, a real nice, like eater size pike. And we were fishing at a small lodge. So there's just these small little Lund boats. He threw it on the stringer. We had a couple walleyes on the stringer. We were told to bring a few fish in because we were going to film like a shore lunch scene with a bunch of people at this lodge. He threw a pike in there and cleaned it up right away before these groups got in there. And then, of course, Gary's always cooking fish, so we're cooking fish, filming it. It's for this promo. These people come over and he's like, here, have some shore lunch. Here's a little appetizer. So he cut up the pike in chunks and fried them as an appetizer and then handed them out to everybody. He was like, oh man, it's hard to beat shore lunch fish. This is delicious. Best walleye I've ever had. Well, it was a pike and they loved it. And they were the same people at the lodge saying that they hated pike. They're disgusting. So I'm telling you, I encourage you to keep a few small pike. If you want to keep a couple in those mid to upper 20s, above 26 in that northeastern zone, you can have your 2 fish. They're excellent. They are excellent. And even these smaller ones, if you take the Y bones out, you can get a really good batch of fish. Pike are easy to catch a lot of times, especially in good numbers. They're great with kids. Like I said, in the fall, they're fantastic and they're great table fare. And so, And nothing against keeping a few pike. I just encourage people to let these big ones go. So now let's get into surface temps, seasonal movements, how these fish are moving, why I get so jacked up in the fall to catch these fish, why it's just like the spring. Like I said, my fishing adventures, usually depend on obviously guiding, but when I get opportunities to fish for species or to fish specific techniques certain times a year, it's usually because there's a bite window in there throughout a calendar year where I can only do that this time of year. If you think, or if you listen to this podcast, there's certain times a year where you can really target big panfish, right? There's certain times a year where, let's say, a topwater bite for smallmouth is ideal. There's a certain time of year where a topwater bite for largemouth is ideal. There's a certain time of year where snap jigging plastics for walleyes are ideal. Right now is the ideal time to target big pike. And if you're going to catch big pike, you've got to go to big pike destinations. I would start with your Onyx Fish app. Look at some of these outliers for big giant pike. Look at some of these lakes that hold big pike. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a Leech Lake or a Mille Lacs or a Winnie or a Cass. There's a lot of small lakes out there that hold big pike. Okay. I know of a lot of lakes that still have big pike, even though they become as rare on all these lakes. There are still lakes in Minnesota that have giant pike, and this is the time of year to target them. So think of it this way. In the spring, these fish will hold in the shallows until that surface, and this is just a rule of thumb, until the surface temperature gets to be mid to upper 60s, then they start sliding out. As soon as surface temps start really rising, let's say after the first part of June, these fish will pull off the edge. They'll move out a lot out of these weed beds, and they'll go out into the basin. They don't live out there all year. They will frequent some of these shallows. You get a day with some wind, some cooler temperatures, even mornings and evenings, and these big pike will slide back in the shallows, but then they'll go back out to the basin. And so their seasonal movements change, whereas in the spring, they're really loaded up in the shallows. Throughout the summer months, they're roamers, right? And you can still catch them. It's just they're not as loaded up as they are in these shallow water areas. What I look for is weed beds, cabbage beds in particular, something like a mid-lake hump with rocks and cabbage on it, something that's going to hold fish. Areas that have, let's say, access to deep water. It doesn't have to be a monster sharp break, but like let's say a big point that sticks out with really nice cabbage and it's got sort of a flat to it, but then it dumps out into deep water. These are areas that I look for a lot. And it could be, a break line. I think of like Mille Lacs or Leech Lake or Cass, for example, where you've got this real sharp break line. And those fish can relate to that sharper break line along the cabbage, okay? And they'll load up along these edges. These same areas hold fish in the fall. You get into this time of year and the perch start moving in the shallows, the walleyes are moving in the shallows, and the pike follow. I always know when I'm in a good perch area when I start catching quality pike. When I start getting big pike, I know that the perch are near. I love perch fishing. We talked about perch fishing on the last podcast. Love, love, love perch fishing. Where the hate of pike comes into play is when you start losing lures when you're perch fishing, right? You're casting out small jigs and plastics, and you're getting bit off by pike, then you're in those good perch areas. Same can be said for pike. When I'm in those areas searching, if I start seeing schools of bait fish and schools of perch in general, especially big perch, I know big pike are near, and that's when I start casting. I look for big standing stock cabbage, love good, healthy cabbage in the fall. And, over the last few years, especially lakes with zebra mussels, that's harder to find. Cabbage gets overrun with this algae, this green algae. When you look at like a byproduct of zebra mussels, they put out a lot of phosphorus. And so a lot of times you get that green algae. It grows on top of this cabbage weed and sort of knocks them over. Also, these lakes where it's really ramping up with zebra mussels, the zebra mussels will cover the weeds, and they actually will be laying over in the fall, and they're harder and harder to find. And so if you can find these big, giant cabbage beds, especially if you get some rocks mixed in, if you find it could be a mid-lake hump, it could be a big point that sticks out, it could be a sharp break line with access to deep water. Those are good areas to find pike, especially big pike. They'll roam those areas. They're somewhat territorial, but, people say, you'll find one big pike holding up. They're not like muskies where they're guarded area. There'll be multiple pike using that area. And, just the other day when I was out fishing, we were catching pike of varying sizes. We caught some that were close to 40 inches, and then we caught other pike that were in the upper 20s, and they were kind of utilizing that same area, different areas of the cabbage, but they were in that same sort of cabbage bed kind of strung all out along that break. So these fish will utilize those areas, and not to say that they won't pull out in the fall. Like, you get a warm afternoon, those fish might come and go in there morning and evening. And they're sort of utilizing that area. But as the surface temperature gets closer to 60 degrees, that's the mark that I look for targeting these fish. Again, we're going to just take a real quick break here. And then I want to get into trolling and casting techniques. I want to talk about my go-to presentations. I'm going to break it down into basically 4 categories. There's obviously more lures out there than you could ever talk about in one podcast, but I want to break down my specific lures that I like using. I don't mind trolling. I love trolling. I like casting. I would say I'm more of a caster than a troller. However, sometimes you got to cover water, and it depends on the situation and the structure you're fishing that will dictate whether you cast or troll and what type of presentations you're going to use. So stay tuned. We got more Dialed In Angling after this.
Visit Cook County, Minnesota, a year-round fishing destination like no other. Spring brings steelhead and smelt runs along the Lake Superior shoreline. In summer, cast for walleye, lake trout, and northern pike in the region's inland lakes and rivers. As the leaves change, so does the fishing, with fall offering some of the best lake trout action around. When winter settles in, grab your gear and head out for ice fishing in a true northern wilderness setting. Whether you're an experienced angler or just discovering the joy of casting a line, Cook County has a spot and a season for you. Learn more and start planning your fishing trip at visitcookcounty.com.
onX Fish is the best tool I have ever used for finding new lakes to target. Quickly filter lakes by species, then select trophy potential, high abundance, keeper potential, or high stocking effort to find the fish you're after in the size and the numbers you are trying to catch. Download from the App Store today to get research tools for the serious anglers and beginners alike, giving you the data to target the right lakes and the confidence to get there. Use tools like recent imagery, fishing hotspot data, or the best-in-class weather features that call out current wind, weather, barometer, moon phase, majors and minors, along with precip and more. onX Fish is a phenomenal tool both on and off the water for discovering new fishing opportunities, many of which you'd never known existed. Download onX Fish Midwest today, the app that is changing the game on ice and open water. Arneson's Rocky Point Resort in northern Minnesota offers a little something for everyone. Nestled on Lake of the Woods South Shore, it provides easy access to 14 remarkable reefs. Serious anglers know that Arneson's offers some of the best fishing, charter fishing, and small boat fishing options, all supported by the largest protected marina on the lake's south shore. Accommodation selections range from 1 to 5 bedrooms. Equipped with all the modern conveniences, guests can enjoy a delightful dining experience and stunning lake views at the Rock Harbor Lodge, an on-site full-service bar and restaurant. The 2 beaches provide hours of fun for the whole family. Whether you're seeking an idyllic fishing spot or a relaxing vacation, Arneson's Rocky Point has everything you need. Check them out at arnesonsresort.com. So my go-to presentations start as follows. I'm going to start with the rod and reel setup. I use multiple rods and reels, and I use both spinning and casting, which sounds interesting, but I used to only use casting rods, but when I started using, let's say, jerk baits, for example, or even snap jigging, like big swim baits, I found a heavy spinning rod to be more my style. Like if you know me, if you've ever fished with me, I work a jerk bait with a spinning rod, right? If I'm bass fishing, I love using like X-Wraps, Shadow Wraps, Mavericks, all that. I'm a huge jerkbait fisherman. I love catching walleyes on jerkbait, smallmouth bass, and jerkbaits are just effective for all sorts of species. And I just know, from the years of fishing jerkbaits, I've caught a lot of pike on jerkbaits. I've caught muskies on jerkbaits. Pike in particular love jerkbaits. So I fish a jerkbait on a spinning rod. And so using a medium heavy spinning rod with 20-pound braid, and then using a fluorocarbon leader or even wire. But most of the time when I'm using a jerkbait, I'm going with a fluorocarbon leader, and I'll use a heavier fluorocarbon, like a 20-pound fluorocarbon. I can work the jerkbait better. When you're using wire on a jerkbait, you don't get the action. It sort of kills the action. And so I'll throw that on a spinning rod. What I like to do is I run a leader that's long enough where it's comfortable casting, and I'll run it on a spinning rod. Now, again, most of the time I'm just using those two techniques. So big swim baits, big jerk baits. On the casting rods, same thing, 20 to 30 pound braid. Usually like a 30 pound is what I have spooled up on most of mine. And then using wire leaders a lot of times with like husky jerks, super shads. There's another category like the inline spinners, spinner baits, even big spoons. That's what I'll use on my casting rods. So let's break down these presentations into 4 categories for big pike. Now, you can catch all size pike, even with big lures. I've caught, lower 20-inch pike on a giant swim bait, for example, or I've caught, big pike, like 40-inch pike on a 3-inch paddle tail when I'm walleye fishing. So I tend to go a little bit bigger with baits when I'm specifically targeting big pike. However, you can still catch big pike on smaller presentations. But let's break them down. These are sort of my go-to categories as followed. Let's start with what I would classify as spinners. So inline spinners, like a blue fox spinner, like a bucktail style spinner. I like to use natural colors. Most of the lakes I'm fishing, are really clear water. However, there are times where I'm using some brighter blades, in particular orange. Pike love orange. I'm a huge orange black fan. I'm also a huge silver and white. I'm also a huge gold and black fan. It just depends on watercolor. And when I say clear water, I'm talking Minnesota is varying clear water. Like Mille Lacs, Winnie, Leech now is starting to clear up, but there's different areas of Leech which are more stained than others. Same can be said for Mille Lacs or Winnebagosh, for example. So like if you're in that clear but a little bit stained area, I might use an orange blade or I might use a different color blade. Whereas if I'm in really clear water, I might, and it's a high sun situation, I might go with a silver blade versus a gold blade. And so I'm mixing it up in that sense. But those inline spinners, like a blue fox or a big spinner bait, like that heavy ounce and a half spinner bait, that tandem axle spinner bait, those giant spinner baits you see, same thing. I like white, I like black and orange, especially on cloudy, rough, nasty days, even on really clear water. It's hard to beat those orange blades on there. They can see them for a long ways, and those big pike just can't resist it. So those are my kind of go-to spinner categories, if you will. I've always got those type of baits in the boat. And then, varying my colors. Like I said, sometimes it's black. It's hard to beat kind of that black bucktail on there. They love that black, but they also like white. White is a very good color, a white spinner bait. I've had white and silver, be my go-to when I, started with black. But that's what's nice if you have multiple anglers in the boat, if you're fishing with a buddy, or a kid or someone in your boat, have one person throw one bait, you throw the other. I usually do. I'll switch back and forth between opposite colors, where I'll have a real bright bait on, and then I'll have a more natural presentation to see which the fish prefer. And you can tip those like the spinner baits too. Don't be afraid to use a trailer. I'm a huge fan of running trailers on there, either like a paddle tail. It doesn't have to be a giant trailer either. It could be like a 4-inch paddle tail, like a Largo Shad or a Crush City or something like that. A paddle tail on there, or even a ribbon tail. I've even taken like some old, ribbon tail worms that were for bass fishing. If you want to get rid of them, just some white, if you've got some old white ones laying around, those work excellent as well. Just a attractor on the back like that to give it a little more action, a little more vibration. Just be careful sometimes if you're using like a heavy trailer, like on a, and I'm talking on the spinner baits, for example. You don't want your spinner bait rotating. Sometimes if you get that paddle tail on the backside, you start reeling it faster. If you're trolling, you'll get that bait to tumble. You don't want that. You want that to run really nice and even on that spinner bait. And so just what I do is I throw it out and just kind of look at it by the boat, make sure it's running properly. And also how you're rigging those plastics. Make sure that you're going dead center of the bait and you're running that bait in line with the spinner, that your hook is coming out precisely on the top, not on the side, because that can contribute to your spinning motion as well. Swim baits. I would say swim bait jig category. I love throwing big swim baits, big paddle tails, anything. Like I said, I sort of go with the bright greens and chartreuses. That's oranges are sort of one color category. And then I use a lot of whites and blacks and greens, kind of the darker colors as well on big jig heads. You can fish like, like the big boxer jigs from VMC, like those heavier duty gauge hooks. Also, even the sleek jigs can work depending on the size of the paddle tail, but bigger jig heads like that, either in quarter, half, 3/4 ounce. I tend to fish a little bit heavier, especially in deeper cabbage, depending on the depth of your cabbage. But a lot of times in the fall, when that cabbage is standing, sometimes on these clear lakes, it'll be 15 to 17 foot cabbage, even deeper weed lines past the cabbage line, where these fish are sort of relating to the outside edge. At least when I'm fishing like a 3/4 ounce or an ounce head, sometimes I'll throw it up into the shallows and I'll work that bait all the way down and just snap jigging that thing through the cabbage. So it's snap, letting it fall, snapping it, just like you do for walleyes, for example, where you're really snapping those baits and letting them fall to the bottom and just working those through. Whereas the spinner baits, the inlines, you're doing a steady retrieve. This is more of a snap jigging. So swim baits, big swim baits, bright colors. You can also do natural colors. And then jigs, hair jigs. You can tip the hair jigs either with minnows, or you can fish them just straight hair. Jigs that I like using, the VMC moontails, the bucktail hair jig, again, in that heavier size, that 1 ounce, 3/4 ounce, and really snap jigging those just like you do the paddle tails. Sometimes that's a little more of a subtle presentation than the big paddle tail. So if you're throwing the big swim baits out there and not getting bit, hair jig is a great option. But again, I like fishing those on a spinning rod rather than a casting rod. And then either tipping them with live bait or just putting a paddle tail on there. If you're using a hair jig, just a 4-inch paddle tail works great. The Crush City paddle tails are awesome. They're very durable. That TPE material on there, you can fish all day. You don't have to worry about pike tearing them up. Even the Storm Largo Shad, that's a really good bait. Bring a little bit of super glue, but they're very durable for pike. Sometimes you use a real soft plastic on there and you're going to be going one bait, one fish. And I like to use something that's a little more durable. So take a look at the Crush City baits, the Crush City Mayor and the 4-inch. It's a real durable bait. You can keep it on the hook a long time. I like those VMC jigs because underneath that bucktail, there's a little keeper on there and it'll keep your bait on there longer. Now let's talk about crankbaits, jerkbaits, crankbaits. I'm going to kind of put those in the same category. X-Wraps. It's hard to beat, like a Magnum X-Wrap, even the large size X-Wrap, a Husky jerk, even the original floater Magnum, sort of working those, just reeling those and jerking those. Jerk baits are probably one of my favorite go-to presentations, spring and fall. Just be careful with the jerk bait. Obviously, you're dealing with a big toothy critter. You've got to have big pliers, gloves on. Be careful when it's in the net, especially if you got kids around or if you're inexperienced handling big fish. Just be careful with crankbaits. That's all I can say is just, you got to use caution, but they work fantastic. They cannot resist those big baits. When you're working like inside weed lines, for example, or big windy flats or rock piles, man, it's hard to beat a jerk bait. They can't resist it. And muskies as well. If you're fishing a lake that has big pike and also has muskies absolutely love jerk baits. Then super shads, like the shallow running or the deep running super shads. If you need to get down a little bit deeper, if you're fishing the outside edge of the weed line, if these fish are still suspended, sometimes they'll suspend the basin outside the weed lines. Those shads are great opportunities to get your bait down there a little bit quicker. And depending on if it's a shallow running or a deep running shad, always great baits for muskie and pike. And then spoons. Don't overlook spoons, big, huge daredevils, even the big weedless spoons, tipping those weedless spoons, tipping those with a plastic on the back. I've caught a lot of pike on those. Pike love those spoons. You can fish those really. So if you're in an area where, you just can't fish a husky jerk or an X-Wrap or any sort of crankbait because of the vegetation, you're constantly getting fouled, look at fishing a weedless spoon. Those are great options. A lot of those big weedless spoons only have one hook, so handling a pike are great. If you're new to big pike fishing, I would highly recommend using something with one hook, just to get your feet wet at handling these fish, getting them in the net, taking them off, getting them back in the water. A giant spoon tipped with a plastic is a great bait. And I should mention one more crankbait just because it is so deadly for big pike. And that's a great big lipless crankbait, like the biggest size you can get, like a number 7 ripping wrap, for example, or a rattling wrap, and snap jigging those through the weeds. They love rattle baits like that. But again, being careful that you're not getting cut off and that you're also, being careful with those treble hooks. Those are sort of my go-tos. Jumped around a little bit there. But if you look at those categories and you break them down from spinners to swim baits and jigs to crankbaits and then spoons, those are the 4 categories. Those are my go-tos, spring and summer, and absolutely deadly. If you're going to start with a few, you don't have to go buy a ton of tackle. It's not like muskie fishing where you've got to invest, thousands of dollars to get started. A couple rod setups. Find an old bass rod that's a heavy frog rod, for example, or find a heavy spinning rod. Put some 20 to 30 pound braid on there, put some big fluorocarbon leaders, and you can be pike fishing in no time. And this is the time of year to do it, to get out and experience it. You don't have to go to big lakes, but I highly recommend that you research a lake that has big pike. I can think of a lot of them. Small lakes around Brainerd that hold big pike. I can think of big pike opportunities out in western Minnesota in the Ottertail area. I could think of big pike that I fish, up by, let's say, Leech and Winnie that have big pike. But then I also look at lakes like Mille Lacs, Leech, Winnie, Cass Lake. All of those lakes have big pike and are fun. And I always say, if you're going to be successful at fishing a species or targeting a specific species, especially big pike because they become rare, go to a lake where you're going to have success doing it. It's only going to breed more success for you. Now with forward-facing sonar, you can see these fish a lot of times when they're up in the shallows. Even in heavier cabbage, if you go slow along the edge of the weed lines, these fish will start to stick out to you, especially because they're active and they're chasing baits. When you see a giant pike chasing your bait down, hitting that bait on forward-facing sonar, you get that 40-inch pike in the boat, take a picture, and throw it back. It's hard to beat, man. They fight like crazy. They're an absolute giant. They're a mythical fish. They're a beautiful thing. Love them or hate them. I'm a huge pike fan, especially big pike. I only get this short window in the fall because it seems like once the water temps drop below, let's say 55, closer to 50 degrees, it seems like these big pike will pull out again. They disappear out into the vastness. You don't see them again until spring. You catch the occasional one. Obviously, in the winter, early ice, you can get some of these fish that'll cruise back in, but they start to peel off a little bit, especially when the muskies come in or whatever the situation, or the perch pull out, and so they start to disappear. So this bite window in the fall is so key to getting on, basically from now until mid-October. It's truly fun. If you've never experienced it, get some gear, take my advice, and get out there. Get a kid out there. They'll be hooked for life. So good luck fishing. Hopefully this gives you some insight into big pike fishing. I know I'm passionate about it. It's what gets me up and gets me excited about fishing this time of year. Fall again. I don't know if you can tell over the past few weeks of my podcast, I'm super jacked about fall fishing because of all of these opportunities like big pike fishing. So good luck to everybody. Until next week, I'm Tony Roach, and this has been the Dialed In Angling Podcast.